I praise, I do not reproach nihilism's arrival. I believe it is one of the greatest crises, a moment of the deepest self-reflection of humanity. Whether man recovers from it, whether he becomes a master of this crisis, is a question of his strength. It is possible. In the previous episode, we discussed the will to power and how, contrary to what one might take as one's first impression, it's not about obtaining power over other people or things, but instead a desire to overcome challenge. We then use this as a lens through which to interpret the various figures of the dragon's Dogma story and mythos as symbols of responses to the challenge of overcoming nihilism, the loss of any ability to justify and thus maintain any sense of meaning or value to life, represented in the game by the character's attitude to the appearance of the dragon. The responses so far have all been what we call anti-life responses, because they ultimately avoid the challenge of overcoming the dragon of nihilism. The last man, or traditionalist response, represented by the commoner, simply ignores the dragon of nihilism and maintains their life of comfortable routine. The madman response, represented by the death cult Salvation, acknowledges the dragon of nihilism, but rather than attempting to overcome it, simply succumbs to it, and declares life not worth living. The Indian and hedonist responses, represented by the dragon forged and duke, respectively, acknowledge the problem of nihilism, make an attempt to resolve it, but ultimately give up and turn away from it to hide in distractions, withdrawing into solitude and vain pleasures, respectively. The only exception to this is the active nihilist response, represented by the dragonkin, because while they ultimately fail in their attempt to overcome nihilism, they continue to struggle against it by worsening it, attacking the worldviews that uphold old value systems to hasten their destruction, in the hopes that this will also hasten the coming of one who will resolve the problem by creating new values and new value systems. However, while they are pro-life, not giving up on the challenge, they are only indirectly so, because directly they are still a force of destruction and nihilism, destroying value systems and thus their own and others' will to live. This brings us then to the one who faces up to the dragon of nihilism, and overcomes it successfully. The true Arisen, the player character, who follows the story of the game through to its end. This response to nihilism is that of the Ubermensch, or overhuman, a person who can create values and give meaning to life. For all Nietzsche wrote about nihilism and overcoming it, Nietzsche still identified himself as a nihilist. He did not actually know how to justify values. However, he did offer some idea of what it would have to look like if one were to do so. This was embodied in the ideal that he posited through the character of Zarathustra in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This ideal was called the Ubermensch, which you can calc into English as overman or overhuman, given that the term is gender neutral. The way that Nietzsche defined the Ubermensch was essentially the most pro-life individual imaginable, and with this, an individual who completely overcomes nihilism. To understand what this means, we must go back to what I said about the will to power earlier, and how it relates to being anti-life. I said that, while Nietzsche acknowledged the existence of other wills, like the will to truth and the will to nothingness, he believed that they were all ultimately still just veiled manifestations of the will to power. Essentially, avoiding challenge is sort of a way to overcome challenge. After all, sometimes avoiding a problem actually solves it. Whether you get rid of the problem or remove yourself from it, you no longer have a problem to deal with. However, even though he saw them as ultimately being the will to power, he still saw an issue with them. He saw them as self-undermining forms of the will to power. When I explained this, it was mainly through the lens of the will to nothingness. Seeking to end all will eventually results in an attempt to end even the will to live, and so it's clear how that is anti-life, and clear how it undermines itself. But the will to truth? And what about several of the figures in Dragon's Dogma that I've been over so far? How are these anti-life? How do these undermine themselves? They don't attempt to end all will. The answer is in the ultimate nature of the will to power. I believe that when Nietzsche proposed his idea of the will to power, he was not so much making a claim about what all creatures want, but more so defining will itself. It is not that we desire to overcome challenge, so much as desire is overcoming challenge. Without challenge, there is no desire. There can be no desire without resistance to be overcome. Imagine you've just fulfilled a desire. What happens? That desire is immediately extinguished. In essence, if we always had exactly what we wanted, we would not want anything at all. This is why life even has will. Because reality does not serve up your needs on a silver platter. It resists you, and so we require intelligent action. The intelligence of intelligent action is no more, no less than will, and as we have established, no will, no meaning. The second point to raise is more or less what I just alluded to. To be alive is to be in this world, and the world resists you constantly. Thus to be alive is to struggle, to be resisted, to overcome challenge. Or in a word, to will. And so our answer lies in the seeking to put an end to challenge. On the one hand, to end all challenge is to end all will, and thus to fall into nihilism. On the other, if you dislike challenge, you simply dislike life itself. Thus, those whose wills undermine themselves by avoiding challenge are the very same wills that dislike life, or to put it another way, the very same wills that are anti-life. With the idea of being anti-life explained, it is now a simple task to explain the idea of being pro-life. It is simply the opposite. The Ubermensch does not seek to put an end to challenge, nor are they simply ambivalent toward it. Instead, in all that they seek, they are always at the same time seeking more challenge. They love life because they love overcoming challenge. In this way, the Ubermensch's will is not self-undermining like the others, neither totally nor partially, but completely self-reinforcing. Their will to power has turned in on itself and become self-aware. The Ubermensch does not merely overcome challenge, but goes a step further. They seek out challenges to be overcome. In doing this, they seek out the means to strengthen their will, and as we also discussed in the previous episode, strengthening the will is the opposite of the fall into nihilism. This is how the Ubermensch is the most pro-life individual possible. Life is overcoming challenge, and the Ubermensch revels in seeking out challenge. Whenever life defies the will of the Ubermensch only grows stronger. This is what Nietzsche also called the amor fati, or the love of fate, a concept he took from the Stoics, when a person so completely accepts reality that they can love whatever happens to them and treat it as a gift. But unlike the Stoics, who sought peace and tranquility, Nietzsche's Ubermensch is brought to more joy and more activity. Hopefully, with all this explanation of how the Ubermensch so utterly and completely is set up to strengthen their will, one can understand how they are the perfect figure for overcoming nihilism. This concept is embedded in Dragon's Dogma in two ways. The first, most obvious one, is the constant mention of the strength of the Arisen's will and how it relates to overcoming challenge, culminating, of course, in the slaying of the dragon. Secondly, though, there is this strange emphasis on the Arisen's will to live and the will to survive. But the game contradicts itself with its own law if one takes this too literally. The Arisen's quest has basically nothing to do with survival, as Grigori says before you face him.
What is your purpose here, Arisen? If you sought to live, you had naught but run and hide yourself away.
The Arisen has no obligation or need to seek out the dragon and win. They even get a massively extended life if they leave the dragon alive. However, with how overcoming challenge connects both strength of will and the will to live, this begins to make sense. The will to survive is a stand-in for the Ubermensch's love of life. There remains one small thing left to explain, however. It's clear that not all Arisen stand for the Ubermensch, as I depicted other Arisens as symbols of a different response to nihilism. So what sets apart those Arisen that stand for the Ubermensch? To find out, let's look at the different possible fates of Arisen. As we've explained, the Arisen is someone who acknowledges the problem of nihilism. However, there are 5 different fates that the Arisen can have, and they each represent something that can happen to you along the way to overcoming nihilism. First of all, an Arisen can be defeated on their quest. This results in them turning into lesser dragonkin, the drakes, worms and wyverns. This represents a failure to overcome nihilism, an inability to find justification for values, and the consequent resorting to an active nihilism response. Second, the Arisen can get to the dragon, but give up, either by simply withdrawing from their quest like the dragon forged, or taking the dragon's bargain like the duke. This represents those who give up on the struggle to overcome nihilism and turn away from it. Now those who defeat the dragon are those who overcome nihilism, as we've previously established. However then, the Arisen must defeat the seneschal, a figure we've not discussed much so far. To properly understand the final 3 fates, we must first understand what the seneschal is and what it means. When an Arisen defeats the dragon, proving the strength of their will, they are called to enter the Everfall, and eventually a portal to go beyond the rift, the origin and dwelling place of pawns. There they find the seneschal, the god of the world of Dragon's Dogma. The seneschal is a former Arisen who did the same and took up the position they are now offering to another. The former Arisen's strong will, once forged in the pursuit and fight with the dragon, is now that which maintains the creation and destruction of all things, and most importantly, to craft the will to live, to keep life going. What would it mean that an Arisen, who has found justification for their values, would meet or become the seneschal? Quite simply, the seneschal represents those who have, of course, first overcome nihilism, but those who have then made their justification for their values a system that can be taken up by an entire society, one that produces a worldview accessible to others. For in the end, what good is it to overcome nihilism if your value system is contradicted by the lives and experiences of others? The Arisen that meets this seneschal is the next person to try and make their system of values become the new worldview of society. Nevertheless, though, one can refuse to do this, and this refusal is enshrined in the 3rd fate of the Arisen, the peace ending. After the seneschal has explained the situation, the Arisen is offered the chance to become the seneschal, but also to return to the world and live as any other person. Sophia, the Arisen who created the pawn Selene, is speculated to have taken this path. One can overcome nihilism just for oneself, and then live one's life out with meaning, but justifying it to nobody else. The 4th fate of the Arisen is another figure we have already discussed, the dragon. The dragon is created when an Arisen attempts to defeat the seneschal and falls in battle. The Arisens that meet this fate overcame nihilism by defeating the dragon, but then attempted to make their justifications for value universal, to apply to everyone, by defeating the seneschal. This is no easy task, and so many are doomed to fail. Not only that, though, their failure exposes the flaws in their system of values, and so just like the lesser dragonkin, such Arisens fall back into nihilism, doomed to be active nihilists until their ultimate demise at the hands of an Arisen. Those who defeat the Seneschal kill him with the God's Bane blade, and become the Seneschal themselves, fulfilling the fifth and final fate of the Arisen. This is the fate of the true Ubermensch, displaying another trait Nietzsche attributed to them: justifying life on earth, full stop, not just for themselves, but for everyone. This harkens back to what we discussed all the way back in the first episode: order and chaos. We previously explained that the dragon represents chaos via destruction. The return of order comes only with its death. However, chaos is not the only threat to a worldview, and this is seldom recognized by people who discuss this topic. So what's the other threat? Well, there's only one other alternative. The other threat is order. Where the threat of chaos is destruction, the threat of order is stagnation. This much is stated in the game.
Without volition, there is no true life. The world falls stagnant, dead as an ocean with no current to guide it.
Once an Arisen becomes Seneschal, representing their fitting of their new worldview, their justification for values, all a product of their strengthened will, to the lives of other people and society at large, they, or their worldview, have become the new order. However, as time goes on, the will of a Seneschal weakens and eventually runs out, and they begin to send dragons into the world to find a replacement. Quite simply, when a new worldview takes hold, just as Christianity did, just as paganism before that, it does provide justification for values for a time. But eventually, inevitably, people's awareness of the flaws in the system becomes clearer and clearer. With this, its ability to justify, to create and revivify values, weakens and dies, and with it the chaotic, creative element that gave birth to it, leaving only cold, stagnant order. When the dragon is slain in Dragon's Dogma, the heart, the will, the creative and chaotic spark is retrieved by the Arisen. They become a true hero, not a force for order, nor a force for chaos, but a force of the harmony of the two. Paradoxically, this makes them perfect for becoming the new order, just as it is for worldviews. They begin with creativity, resolving problems, overcoming challenges, but eventually they decay and die and must be replaced. And so we come to the end of our journey through the meaning of Dragon's Dogma, and we see that the mythos of eternal return, the endless cycle of Arisens and Seneschals, is not just an allegory for the overcoming of nihilism on the level of individuals. Even the world itself is trying to overcome nihilism by feeding on the will of the Seneschal, leading to chaos entering the world again in the form of a dragon, a new Arisen being chosen and then replacing the Seneschal over and over again. Nietzsche posited this idea of eternal repetition in his works, called eternal recurrence, for other purposes, so it's not so much represented in the game symbolically, as it is simply an allusion to Nietzsche. But it serves well for this eternal cycle of creation, stagnation, destruction, and recreation that worldviews must go through as humanity struggles against and overcomes nihilism again and again. Thank you for watching. This project took 2 months to write, and now that I'm done with this script, at least another month to finish editing. So please, if you appreciated it, please support me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video and it's made you think about how you justify your own values. If you aren't quite sure how people in general should justify their values, I ask you, will you be a last man commoner or an Ubermensch Arisen? Do you dare become a Seneschal?